The Mississippi heat hung thick as molasses over Whitmore Plantation in the summer of 1828, when the boy first arrived in chains. Master Edmund Whitmore had purchased him at the New Orleans slave market for a price so low that even the auctioneer seemed surprised. The child couldn't have been more than 12 years old, with skin dark as river mud and eyes that seemed to hold depths no child should possess. "What's his name?" Whitmore asked the trader, mopping sweat from his brow with a silk handkerchief. "Calls himself Samuel, sir. Previous owner said he was difficult. That's why the price is what it is." Overseer Jeremiah Kane studied the boy with the calculating gaze of a man who had broken hundreds of spirits. Tall and lean as a scarecrow, with pale eyes that missed nothing, Kane had earned his reputation through methods that made even hardened plantation owners uncomfortable. He noticed how the other slaves in the auction pen seemed to give the boy a wide berth, as if he carried some invisible contagion. The journey to Whitmore Plantation took 3 days by wagon. Samuel sat in silence among the other newly purchased slaves, his small hands folded in his lap, never speaking, never crying, never showing any emotion at all. The other slaves whispered among themselves in hushed tones, but whenever their conversations turned to the boy, they fell silent and looked away. On the second night, camped beside a creek, one of the wagon wheels cracked without explanation. The driver, a grizzled man named Pete, examined the wheel with growing confusion. "Ain't never seen nothing like it," he muttered to Kane. "Wheel just split clean down the middle, like something hit it with an axe, but there ain't no marks, no damage from the outside." Kane's pale eyes drifted to Samuel, who sat motionless by the dying fire, staring into the flames with an intensity that made the overseer's skin crawl. The boy's lips moved silently, as if he were speaking to someone only he could see. When they finally reached Whitmore Plantation, the Spanish moss hanging from the ancient oaks seemed to whisper warnings in the humid breeze. The plantation house, a grand structure with white columns and wraparound porches, stood like a monument to prosperity built on human suffering. Behind it stretched endless fields of cotton, tended by nearly 200 enslaved souls who lived in the cramped quarters beyond the main house. Kane personally escorted Samuel to the slave quarters, a collection of rough wooden cabins that housed the plantation's workforce. The other slaves watched from doorways and windows as the boy was led to his assigned cabin, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and something that looked remarkably like fear. "You'll be working the fields," Kane informed Samuel, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "Dawn to dusk, no exceptions. You cause trouble, you'll answer to me. And boy," he leaned down until his face was inches from Samuel's, "I've never met a slave I couldn't break." Samuel looked up at him with those unsettling dark eyes and spoke for the first time since his arrival. His voice was soft, almost musical, but there was something in it that made Kane's blood run cold. "Yes, sir, I understand." That night, as the plantation settled into the restless sleep of the oppressed and the guilty, strange sounds echoed from the direction of the slave quarters. Dogs howled in the distance, and several slaves later swore they heard voices speaking in languages that predated the arrival of any white man in Mississippi. In his cabin, Samuel lay on his thin straw mattress, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. His lips moved in that same silent conversation, and if anyone had been brave enough to listen closely, they might have heard him whispering names of people who had died on this land. Names that had been forgotten by everyone except the earth itself. The next morning, Kane found 3 dead crows arranged in a perfect triangle outside Samuel's cabin door. Their necks were unbroken, their bodies unmarked, as if they had simply chosen to die in that exact spot. The overseer kicked the birds aside with his boot, but the image stayed with him throughout the day, a dark omen of things to come. As Samuel was led to the fields for his first day of work, the other slaves watched with a mixture of pity and terror. Old Martha, the plantation's cook and unofficial spiritual leader among the enslaved community, crossed herself and muttered a prayer under her breath. "Lord, have mercy," she whispered to her companion, Sarah. "That child carries something dark with him. I can feel it in my bones." The cotton fields stretched endlessly under the merciless Mississippi sun, and as Samuel took his place among the workers, the very air seemed to grow heavier. The overseer's whip cracked in the distance, but for the first time in his career, Jeremiah Kane felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. Something had come to Whitmore Plantation, something that would challenge everything Kane thought he knew about power, control, and the nature of evil itself. 3 weeks into Samuel's arrival at Whitmore Plantation, the first incident occurred during the pre-dawn hours when the slaves were roused for another day of backbreaking labor. Kane's assistant, a brutal man named Tucker, went to wake the field hands with his usual combination of shouting and the crack of his whip. But when he reached Samuel's cabin, he found the boy already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed, fully dressed and ready for work. "How long you been awake, boy?" Tucker demanded, suspicious of anything that deviated from routine. "I don't sleep much, sir," Samuel replied in that same soft, unsettling voice. Tucker was about to respond when he noticed something that made his blood freeze. Every tool in the cabin, hoes, sickles, and cotton sacks belonging to Samuel's cabin mates, had been arranged in a perfect circle around the boy's bed. The other slaves in the cabin claimed to have slept through the night, insisting they had no knowledge of how their tools had been moved. Word of the incident reached Kane before breakfast, and the overseer stormed into the cabin to investigate. He found the tools, exactly as Tucker had described, arranged with mathematical precision that seemed impossible for a 12-year-old boy to achieve in complete darkness without waking anyone. "You do this, boy?" Kane's voice carried the promise of violence. Samuel looked up at him with those dark, fathomless eyes. "No, sir. I was sleeping." But Kane noticed that Samuel's hands were clean, too clean for someone who had supposedly spent the night sleeping on a dirt floor. And there was something else, something that made the overseer's skin crawl. The tools weren't just arranged in a circle, they were pointing inward, toward Samuel's bed, like the spokes of a wheel or the points of a compass, all focused on the boy as if he were some kind of magnetic center. The incident might have been dismissed as a prank, if not for what happened later that morning in the cotton fields. Samuel was assigned to work alongside Big Jim, a massive man whose strength was legendary among the plantation's workforce. Jim had been at Whitmore for 15 years and had never shown anything but complete submission to the overseer's authority. But as the morning progressed, Jim began to act strangely. He kept glancing at Samuel with growing agitation, muttering under his breath and shaking his head as if trying to clear unwanted thoughts. By midday, Jim was sweating profusely, despite the fact that he was barely working, his hands trembling as he fumbled with his cotton sack. "What's wrong with you, Jim?" Kane demanded, riding up on his horse to investigate the disruption. "It's the boy, sir," Jim whispered, his voice barely audible. He's talking to me, but his mouth ain't moving. I can hear him in my head, telling me things, terrible things about what happened to the people who used to work this land." Kane's pale eyes narrowed as he looked at Samuel, who continued picking cotton with mechanical efficiency, showing no sign that he was even aware of the conversation taking place nearby. The boy's face was a mask of concentration, but there was something in his posture, something in the way he moved, that suggested he was listening to every word. "You're imagining things," Kane snapped at Jim. "Get back to work before I give you something real to worry about." But Jim's condition only worsened as the day progressed. By afternoon, he was talking to himself constantly, his eyes wide with terror as he described visions of slaves who had died on the plantation, their spirits walking among the cotton rows, seeking justice for wrongs that could never be righted. The breaking point came when Jim suddenly threw down his cotton sack and pointed a shaking finger at Samuel. "He's showing me things," Jim screamed. "Dead people, sir. They're all around us and they're angry. So angry." Kane's whip cracked across Jim's back. But for the first time in 15 years, the big man didn't flinch. Instead, he turned to face the overseer with eyes that seemed to see beyond the physical world. "You killed them," Jim whispered. "You killed so many of them, and now they want their due." The whip cracked again, and this time Jim collapsed to his knees, but his eyes never left Samuel's face. The boy had stopped picking cotton and was watching the scene with an expression of mild curiosity, as if he were observing an interesting but ultimately unimportant experiment. That evening, as the slaves returned to their quarters, word of Jim's breakdown spread through the community like wildfire. The older slaves, those who remembered the plantation's darker history, began to whisper about curses and spirits, about the price that must eventually be paid for the blood that had soaked into Mississippi soil. Old Martha pulled Samuel aside as he walked past her cabin. "Child," she said, her voice heavy with concern and fear, "what are you?" Samuel looked up at her with those unsettling dark eyes, and for a moment, Martha thought she saw something ancient and terrible looking back at her. "I'm just a boy, Mom," he said softly. "Just a boy who remembers things." But as he walked away, Martha noticed that the ground where he had been standing was covered with dead insects. Beetles, ants, and flies that had simply stopped living the moment they came too close to the child. In his house, Master Whitmore poured himself a generous glass of bourbon and tried to ignore the reports filtering up from his overseer. Strange incidents, Kane had said, unusual behavior among the slaves. Nothing that couldn't be handled with proper discipline. But as Whitmore sat in his study, surrounded by the trappings of his wealth and power, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed on his plantation. The very air seemed different, charged with an energy that made his skin crawl and his sleep restless. Outside, the Mississippi night was filled with sounds that didn't belong, whispers in languages that predated European settlement, the rustle of movement where no wind blew, and underneath it all the soft sound of a child's voice speaking to listeners that only he could see. Jeremiah Kane had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to understand their weaknesses and exploit them with surgical precision. In his 20 years as an overseer, he had broken spirits that others deemed unbreakable, had reduced proud men to cowering shadows through a combination of psychological manipulation and calculated brutality. But Samuel was different. The boy seemed to exist in a space beyond Kane's understanding, immune to the fear that governed every other soul on the plantation. The morning after Big Jim's breakdown, Kane decided to take a more direct approach. He found Samuel in the fields before dawn, sitting alone among the cotton plants, his small hands moving through the soil as if he were searching for something buried beneath the earth. "What are you doing, boy?" Kane's voice cut through the pre-dawn silence like a blade. Samuel looked up without surprise, as if he had been expecting the overseer's arrival. "The ground remembers, sir. It holds on to things that happened here." "What kind of things?" "Pain, mostly. Fear. The last thoughts of people who died here." Samuel's voice remained soft and matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. "Sometimes they try to tell me their stories." Kane felt a chill despite the humid Mississippi air. "You're talking nonsense, boy. Dead people don't tell stories." Samuel tilted his head slightly, studying the overseer with those unsettling dark eyes. "Don't they, sir? Then why do you hear them at night?" The question hit Kane like a physical blow. For weeks, he'd been plagued by dreams filled with voices he couldn't quite understand, faces he couldn't quite remember. He had attributed them to stress, to the pressures of managing an increasingly restless workforce. But the boy's words suggested something far more disturbing. "I don't know what you're talking about," Kane said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "The woman with the scarred hands," Samuel continued, his gaze never leaving Kane's face. She calls your name sometimes, and the man who tried to run away last winter, he's still angry about what you did to him in the barn." Cain's hand instinctively moved to the whip at his belt. The woman with scarred hands had been a troublemaker, a slave who had tried to organize resistance among the workers. He had made an example of her, had used methods that even Master Whitmore preferred not to know about. And the runaway, Marcus had been his name. Cain had indeed taken him to the barn for a private lesson in obedience. Marcus had died from his injuries 3 days later. "You're lying," Cain whispered. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true. There was no way the boy could know these details, no way he could have learned about incidents that had been carefully hidden from the other slaves. Samuel stood up slowly, brushing dirt from his hands. "They want you to remember them, sir. They want you to know that what you did matters, that it left marks on this place that can't be washed away." Over the following days, Cain found himself watching Samuel with growing obsession. He assigned the boy to work directly under his supervision, telling himself it was to prevent further incidents, but in truth, he was desperate to understand how Samuel knew things that should have been impossible for him to know. The boy worked with quiet efficiency, never complaining, never showing signs of fatigue, even under the brutal Mississippi sun. But strange things continued to happen around him. Tools would malfunction without explanation, animals would refuse to come near him, and other slaves began to report dreams filled with voices speaking in languages they didn't recognize. Cain started keeping a journal, documenting every unusual incident, every strange occurrence that seemed connected to Samuel's presence. The entries grew increasingly frantic as the weeks passed. July 15th. Found 3 more dead birds outside the boy's cabin. No signs of injury or disease. Dr. Morrison examined them and found nothing. July 18th. Sarah claims the boy spoke to her in her dead mother's voice. Impossible, but she knew details about her mother that no one else could know. July 22nd. Discovered the boy standing in the middle of the cotton field at midnight, surrounded by fireflies that formed perfect geometric patterns. When I approached, they all died simultaneously. July 25th. The boy asked me about my brother. I never told anyone on this plantation that I had a brother. He died when we were children, drowned in a river in Virginia. How could the boy know? The final entry was different from the others, written in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as the words progressed. July 28th, I understand now. The boy isn't just remembering things. He's connected to them, to all the pain and suffering that has happened on this land. He's like a conduit, a channel through which the dead can speak. And they have so much to say, so much anger, so much hunger for justice. I can hear them now, even when I'm awake. They whisper my name, tell me about the things I've done, the lives I've destroyed. They want payment, they want balance, and they're using the boy to collect what's owed. God help me. I think they're right. Master Whitmore found the journal 3 days later after Cain failed to appear for his morning rounds. The overseer was discovered in his quarters, sitting in a chair facing the window that looked out over the slave cabins. His eyes were open but unseeing, and his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Dr. Morrison, the plantation's physician, could find no medical explanation for Cain's condition. The man was alive but completely unresponsive, as if his mind had simply retreated to some unreachable place. The only sign of life was the way his lips moved constantly, forming words that no one could understand. Samuel, when questioned about the overseer's condition, showed no emotion beyond mild curiosity. "Sometimes people see too much," he said softly. "Sometimes the truth is more than they can carry." As word of Cain's breakdown spread through the plantation, The atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The slaves whispered about curses and divine justice, while Master Whitmore struggled to maintain order with his most effective enforcer reduced to a mindless shell. But in the cotton fields, Samuel continued his work with the same quiet efficiency, his dark eyes reflecting depths that seemed to hold the accumulated weight of every injustice ever committed on Mississippi soil. The boy who had arrived in chains was becoming something far more dangerous than any overseer had ever imagined, a living reminder that some debts could never be forgotten and that the dead had their own ways of seeking payment. Master Edmund Whitmore had built his fortune on the principle that fear was the most reliable currency in the business of human bondage. For 30 years, he had maintained absolute control over his plantation through a carefully calibrated system of rewards and punishments, always ensuring that hope never quite died while making certain that rebellion seemed impossible. But Samuel's presence had introduced a variable that Whitmore couldn't calculate, a force that operated outside the rules he had spent decades perfecting. The morning after Cain's breakdown, Whitmore stood in his study, staring out at the cotton fields where nearly 200 slaves continued their work under the supervision of Tucker, who had been hastily promoted to replace the catatonic overseer. The plantation looked the same as it always had, but Whitmore could feel something different in the air, a tension that seemed to emanate from the small figure of Samuel working among the cotton plants. Dr. Morrison had been unable to provide any explanation for Cain's condition, beyond suggesting that the man had suffered some kind of severe psychological trauma. But Whitmore had read the overseer's journal, had seen the progression from skepticism to obsession to terror, and he knew that whatever had happened to Cain was connected to the boy he had purchased for such a suspiciously low price in New Orleans. "Sir?" Tucker's voice interrupted Whitmore's thoughts. The new overseer stood in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. "We need to talk about the boy." Whitmore turned from the window, noting the way Tucker's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "What about him?" "The other slaves, sir. They're starting to act different around him. Not rebellious exactly, but changed. They look at him like he's something more than just another field hand." "Explain." Tucker shifted uncomfortably. "Yesterday I saw old Martha bow to him when she thought no one was looking. And some of the younger slaves have started leaving things outside his cabin. Flowers, pieces of food, little carved figures. It's like they're making offerings to him." Whitmore felt a chill run down his spine. Religious movements among slaves were always dangerous, but this seemed to be something else entirely. "Have you spoken to the boy about this?" "I tried, sir, but when I look at him, it's like he can see right through me, like he knows things about me that I never told anyone." Tucker's voice dropped to a whisper. "Things I did before I came to work here. Things I thought I'd left behind." That afternoon, Whitmore decided to confront Samuel directly. He found the boy working alone in a section of the field that had been damaged by a recent storm, methodically replanting cotton seeds in the churned earth. Samuel looked up as Whitmore approached, showing no surprise at the master's presence. "You're causing problems on my plantation," Whitmore said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. Samuel continued planting seeds as he spoke. "I'm just working, sir, same as everyone else. Don't play games with me, boy. I know what you've been doing. The other slaves are starting to look at you like you're some kind of prophet or spirit. That kind of thinking is dangerous." Samuel paused in his work and looked up at Whitmore with those unsettling dark eyes. "What do you think I am, sir?" The question caught Whitmore off guard. He had expected denial, perhaps defiance, but not this calm curiosity. "I think you're a very clever boy who's learned how to manipulate people's superstitions for your own benefit." "And what benefit would that be, sir? I'm still a slave. I still work in your fields from dawn to dusk. I still sleep in a cabin with a dirt floor and eat scraps from your table." Samuel's voice remained soft and respectful, but there was something underneath it that made Whitmore's skin crawl. "What could I possibly gain from making people think I'm something I'm not?" Whitmore found himself struggling to answer. The boy was right. His position hadn't changed. His circumstances hadn't improved. If anything, the attention he was receiving from the other slaves only made him more vulnerable to punishment. "Then what are you?" Whitmore asked, hating himself for the question even as it left his lips. Samuel smiled, and for a moment Whitmore saw something ancient and terrible looking back at him. "I'm memory, sir. I'm all the things that happened on this land that people tried to forget. I'm the voice of everyone who died here without anyone to remember their names." That night, Whitmore found himself unable to sleep. He paced through his house, checking and rechecking the locks on doors and windows, though he couldn't say what he was trying to keep out. The plantation felt different in the darkness, as if the very shadows had taken on a life of their own. Around midnight, he heard singing coming from the direction of the slave quarters. It wasn't unusual for the slaves to sing in the evenings, but this was different. The melody was haunting and unfamiliar, and the words seemed to be in a language that predated any European settlement in Mississippi. Whitmore grabbed a lantern and made his way toward the sound, his heart pounding with a fear he couldn't name. He found nearly 50 slaves gathered in a circle around Samuel's cabin, their voices raised in that strange, beautiful song. Samuel himself sat in the center of the circle, his eyes closed, his lips moving in silent conversation with invisible listeners. "What is the meaning of this?" Whitmore demanded, his voice cracking with authority and fear. The singing stopped abruptly, and 50 pairs of eyes turned toward him. But instead of the fear and submission he expected to see, Whitmore found himself looking at faces filled with something that looked remarkably like pity. Old Martha stepped forward, her weathered hands clasped in front of her. "We're just singing, Master Whitmore. Singing for the ones who can't sing for themselves anymore." "Singing for who?" "The dead, sir. The ones who died on this land and never got a proper farewell. The boy, he helps us remember them." Whitmore's lantern trembled in his hand as he looked at Samuel, who had opened his eyes and was watching him with that same unsettling calm. "This stops now. All of it. I won't have this kind of witchcraft on my plantation." But even as he spoke the words, Whitmore knew they were empty. The power that had once seemed absolute was slipping away from him, eroded by something he couldn't understand or control. The slaves dispersed quietly, but their eyes held a knowledge that chilled him to the bone. As Whitmore walked back to his house, he heard Samuel's voice behind him, soft but carrying clearly in the humid night air. "The dead don't forget, sir, and they don't forgive. They just wait." In his study, Whitmore poured himself a large glass of bourbon and tried to convince himself that he was still in control of his plantation. But as he sat in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the Mississippi night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The boy who had arrived in chains was becoming the center of something larger than himself, something that threatened the very foundation of the world Whitmore had built. And for the first time in 30 years, the master of Whitmore Plantation was afraid. The first death occurred on a Tuesday morning in late August, when the Mississippi heat had reached a fever pitch that seemed to press down on the plantation like the weight of accumulated sins. Thomas Hartwell, a neighboring plantation owner who had come to discuss a business arrangement with Whitmore, was found dead in the guest bedroom, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Dr. Morrison examined the body with growing bewilderment. Hartwell appeared to have died of heart failure, but he was only 42 years old and had been in perfect health the evening before. More disturbing were the scratches covering his arms and chest, thin, precise marks that looked as if they had been made by fingernails, though Hartwell's own nails were unbroken and clean. "It's as if he was fighting off attackers," Morrison told Whitmore as they stood over the body. "But there are no signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone else was in the room." Whitmore stared down at Hartwell's corpse, remembering the man's reputation for brutality toward his own slaves. The scratches on his body formed patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like words written in a language of pain and fear. What could have caused this? Whitmore asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Morrison shook his head. I've never seen anything like it. It's as if he literally died of fright. That afternoon, as Hartwell's body was prepared for burial, word of the death spread through the slave quarters with the speed of wildfire. The reaction was unlike anything Whitmore had ever witnessed. Instead of the usual mixture of fear and curiosity that accompanied such events, the slaves seemed almost satisfied. They went about their work with a quiet efficiency that suggested they had been expecting this development. Samuel, when questioned about his whereabouts during the night, claimed to have been sleeping in his cabin, but several slaves reported seeing strange lights moving through the plantation house around midnight, and one of the house servants swore she had heard voices speaking in the guest bedroom, multiple voices, though only Hartwell was supposed to be inside. The second death came 3 days later. Jacob Morrison, Dr. Morrison's younger brother and a frequent visitor to the plantation, was found drowned in the shallow creek that ran along the property's eastern border. The water was barely 2 feet deep, and Morrison was known to be an excellent swimmer. More puzzling was the fact that his body showed no signs of struggle, no evidence that he had fought against drowning. It's impossible, Dr. Morrison said, his voice breaking as he examined his brother's corpse. Jacob could swim before he could walk. There's no way he could have drowned in water this shallow unless... Unless what? Whitmore demanded. Unless he wanted to. Unless something made him want to. The pattern became clear with the third death. Reverend William Ashford, a fire and brimstone preacher who regularly visited the plantation to deliver sermons about the divine order that placed white men above their darker-skinned brothers, was found hanging from a rope in the plantation's chapel. The rope had been fashioned from cotton fibers, and Ashford's final sermon lay scattered on the floor beneath his feet, pages torn and rearranged to spell out accusations in his own handwriting. Tucker discovered the body and immediately sought out Whitmore, his face pale with terror. "Sir, you need to see this. The Reverend," he wrote things. Terrible things about what he did to slaves on other plantations, things no one else could have known. Whitmore read the scattered pages with growing horror. Ashford had apparently spent his final hours writing a detailed confession of crimes that spanned decades. Rapes, murders, tortures that he had justified through twisted interpretations of scripture. The handwriting was definitely Ashford's, but the content suggested a level of self-awareness that the arrogant preacher had never displayed in life. How could he have known to write these things? Tucker whispered. And why would he hang himself after confessing? Whitmore looked toward the slave quarters, where Samuel could be seen working in the cotton fields with his usual quiet efficiency. I don't think he wrote them voluntarily. That evening, Whitmore confronted Samuel directly, finding the boy sitting alone outside his cabin, his dark eyes reflecting the light of the setting sun. "3 men are dead," Whitmore said without preamble. 3 men who all had connections to this plantation, and all of them died in ways that make no sense. Samuel looked up at him with that same unsettling calm. "Death rarely makes sense to the living, sir, but it always makes sense to the dead." "Did you kill them?" "I'm just a boy, sir. How could I kill grown men?" "That's not an answer." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the cotton fields where generations of slaves had lived and died in bondage. "The dead have their own ways of seeking justice, sir. Sometimes they just need someone to help them remember how." "You're talking about murder. I'm talking about balance." Samuel's voice remained soft, but there was something in it that made Whitmore's blood run cold. For every action, there's a reaction. For every cruelty, there's a reckoning. The men who died, they had debts that needed to be paid. Whitmore felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, the certainty of his world crumbling like sand. "And what about me? Do I have debts that need to be paid?" Samuel smiled, and in that smile, Whitmore saw the accumulated weight of every injustice ever committed on his plantation. "What do you think, sir?" That night, Whitmore barricaded himself in his study, a loaded pistol on the desk beside him. But as the hours passed, he began to understand that physical weapons would be useless against whatever force Samuel had awakened. The boy wasn't just a conduit for the dead, he was their instrument of justice, their way of balancing scales that had been weighted with blood and suffering for far too long. Outside, the plantation settled into an uneasy quiet, but Whitmore could feel the presence of invisible watchers, the weight of eyes that had been closed in death but had somehow found a way to see again. The reckoning had begun, and there was nowhere left to run. In his cabin, Samuel lay on his thin mattress, his eyes open and staring at the ceiling. His lips moved in that familiar silent conversation, but tonight the voices seemed stronger, more insistent. They had tasted justice, and they hungered for more. The boy who had arrived in chains was becoming something far more powerful than any master had ever imagined. A living reminder that some debts could never be forgotten, and that the dead had their own ways of collecting what was owed. Edmund Whitmore had not slept in 4 days. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his hands trembled as he poured his morning bourbon, the amber liquid spilling across the mahogany surface of his desk. Outside his study window, the plantation continued its daily rhythm, but everything felt different now, charged with an energy that made his skin crawl and his heart race with inexplicable dread. The deaths had stopped after Reverend Ashford, but the silence was somehow worse than the violence. It felt like the calm before a storm, a gathering of forces that Whitmore could sense but not see. The slaves went about their work with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural, their movements coordinated, as if they were responding to signals only they could hear. Tucker had fled 2 nights ago, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled note. "Can't stay. The boy knows things. They all know things. God help us all." Whitmore had found the note pinned to his door with a cotton thorn, the paper stained with what looked like tears. Now Whitmore stood alone as the master of a plantation that no longer felt like his own. He had sent word to neighboring plantations, requesting assistance, but the responses had been troubling. Other masters reported similar incidents, unexplained deaths, strange behavior among their slaves, and always stories of children who seemed to know things they shouldn't know. "It's spreading," Whitmore muttered to himself, staring out at the cotton fields where Samuel worked with mechanical precision. "Whatever he is, whatever he's doing, it's spreading to other plantations." The realization hit him like a physical blow. Samuel wasn't just affecting Whitmore Plantation, he was part of something larger, a network of children who carried the accumulated memory of every injustice ever committed on Southern soil. They were connected somehow, sharing information across vast distances, coordinating a response that had been building for generations. Whitmore grabbed his pistol and strode out of the house, his mind made up. If Samuel was the source of the plague that had infected his plantation, then removing the boy would solve the problem. It was simple logic, the kind of direct action that had served him well throughout his life. He found Samuel in the same section of the cotton field where they had spoken before, the boy's small hands moving through the plants with practiced efficiency. Samuel looked up as Whitmore approached, showing no surprise at the sight of the loaded weapon. "You're going to kill me," Samuel said, his voice carrying the same soft certainty it always did. "You've left me no choice." Whitmore raised the pistol, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You've brought nothing but death and chaos to my plantation. Have I?" Samuel tilted his head slightly, studying Whitmore with those unsettling dark eyes. "Or have I simply reminded you of the death and chaos that was already here? You're a demon, an abomination." Samuel smiled sadly. "I'm a mirror, sir. I reflect what's already present. The anger, the pain, the hunger for justice, none of that came from me. It was always here, buried in the soil, waiting for someone to give it voice. Whitmore's hand trembled as he aimed the pistol at Samuel's chest. "Then I'll silence that voice, will you?" Samuel's gaze drifted past Whitmore, and the master turned to see what had captured the boy's attention. The entire slave population of the plantation was walking toward them across the cotton fields. Nearly 200 men, women, and children moved with silent purpose, their faces reflecting a determination that Whitmore had never seen before. They weren't running or shouting or showing any signs of the rebellion he had always feared. Instead, they walked with the measured pace of people who knew their time had finally come. "What do they want?" Whitmore whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "To witness," Samuel replied, "to see justice done for all the people who died on this land without anyone to speak for them." Whitmore spun back toward Samuel, his finger tightening on the trigger, but found himself unable to pull it. The boy stood perfectly still, his dark eyes reflecting depths that seemed to hold the accumulated weight of centuries of suffering. "You can't kill me," Samuel said softly, "because I'm not really alive in the way you understand it. I'm memory given form, pain given voice. I'm every slave who died in these fields, every child torn from their mother's arms, every soul broken on the altar of your prosperity." The slaves had formed a circle around them now, their faces solemn but not threatening. Old Martha stepped forward, her weathered hands clasped in front of her. "Master Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying a dignity that made him flinch. "It's time." "Time for what?" "Time for you to understand what you've done. Time for you to feel what we've felt. Time for you to know the weight of the pain you've caused." Whitmore looked around the circle of faces, seeing for the first time not property or tools, but human beings whose lives he had controlled and destroyed with casual indifference. The pistol felt impossibly heavy in his hand. "I gave you food," he said desperately. "Shelter. I could have worked you harder, treated you worse." "You gave us scraps," Old Martha replied. "You gave us hovels. You gave us just enough to keep us alive so we could make you rich. And when we died, you replaced us like broken tools." Samuel stepped closer to Whitmore, his small hand reaching out to touch the master's trembling arm. The contact sent a shock through Whitmore's system, and suddenly he could see, really see, what his plantation looked like through the eyes of the enslaved. He saw children torn from their mothers and sold to distant plantations. He saw women brutalized by overseers while their husbands were forced to watch. He saw men worked to death in the cotton fields, their bodies buried in unmarked graves beyond the plantation boundaries. He saw the casual cruelties, the deliberate humiliations, the systematic destruction of human dignity that had been the foundation of his wealth. But more than that, he felt it, the pain, the despair, the crushing weight of hopelessness that had defined the lives of everyone who had ever been enslaved on his land. It poured into him like poison, filling his mind with the accumulated suffering of generations. Whitmore dropped the pistol and fell to his knees, his body racked with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his own soul. "I didn't know," he gasped. "I didn't understand." "You didn't want to know," Samuel said gently. "You didn't want to understand. It was easier to see us as things rather than people." The circle of slaves began to sing, their voices rising in that same haunting melody Whitmore had heard before. But now he could understand the words, could feel their meaning in his bones. It was a song of mourning and remembrance, a lament for all the lives that had been lost and forgotten. As the song continued, Whitmore felt something breaking inside him, not his spirit, but the walls he had built around his conscience, the barriers that had allowed him to sleep peacefully while surrounded by so much suffering. The weight of his crimes pressed down on him like a physical force, and he understood that this was only the beginning. Samuel knelt beside him, his small hand resting on Whitmore's shoulder. "The dead don't want revenge," the boy said softly. "They want acknowledgement. They want their stories to be told, their names to be remembered. They want the world to know that they mattered." Whitmore looked up at the faces surrounding him, seeing them clearly for the first time in his life. "What do you want from me?" "Truth," old Martha said simply. "Write it down. All of it. Every name you can remember, every life that was lost, every cruelty that was committed. Give the dead their voices back." Dish. As the sun set over the cotton fields of Whitmore Plantation, the master who had once ruled with absolute authority began the long process of accounting for his sins. But even as he wrote, he knew that some debts could never be fully repaid, and that the boy who had arrived in chains would continue his work until every plantation, every master, every participant in the machinery of human bondage had faced their own reckoning. The dead were patient, but they would not be denied their due. 6 months after the first death at Whitmore Plantation, the story had spread across the entire Mississippi Delta like wildfire through dry cotton. Plantation owners from Louisiana to Tennessee reported similar incidents. Mysterious deaths of overseers and masters, strange behavior among their enslaved populations, and always children who seemed to carry knowledge that no child should possess. Edmund Whitmore had aged 20 years in those 6 months. His hair had turned completely white, and his hands shook constantly as he worked on the manuscript that had consumed his life. The document had grown to over 300 pages, a meticulous record of every atrocity committed on his plantation, every life lost, every family destroyed. He wrote with the desperate fervor of a man seeking redemption for sins that could never be forgiven. Samuel still worked in the cotton fields, but his role had evolved beyond that of a simple field hand. The other slaves looked to him for guidance, and visitors to the plantation reported that the boy seemed to know things about their own properties, their own crimes, that should have been impossible for him to know. Dr. Morrison, the only white man who still regularly visited the plantation, had become obsessed with documenting what he called the phenomenon. His medical journals were filled with observations about Samuel and the other children who had begun appearing on plantations throughout the region. "They're connected somehow," Morrison told Whitmore during one of his visits. "I've spoken to physicians from a dozen different plantations, and they all report the same thing. Children who arrived recently, purchased at unusually low prices, who seem to carry memories that aren't their own." Whitmore looked up from his writing, his eyes bloodshot from months of sleepless nights. "How many?" "At least 50 that I know of, probably more. They're appearing everywhere. And wherever they go, the same things happen. Masters die mysteriously, overseers break down, and the enslaved populations begin to change." "Change how?" Morrison struggled to find the words. "They become more than they were before. Not rebellious exactly, but aware. As if they've suddenly remembered something they had forgotten." The truth was more complex than Morrison could have imagined. Samuel and the other children weren't just carrying memories. They were part of a vast network of consciousness that spanned the entire South, connected by bonds that transcended physical distance. They shared information, coordinated their actions, and worked together to ensure that the crimes of slavery would not be forgotten or ignored. The network had been building for generations, fed by the accumulated pain and suffering of millions of enslaved souls. Each death, each separation, each act of cruelty had added to its strength until it reached a critical mass that allowed it to manifest in physical form through children like Samuel. These children were not demons or supernatural beings, as some claimed. They were something far more powerful. They were memory itself, given voice and agency. They carried within them the stories of everyone who had died in bondage, and they would not rest until those stories were told and acknowledged. The plantation system, built on the deliberate dehumanization of an entire race, had created its own destruction. By treating human beings as property, by denying their humanity and erasing their individual identities, the masters had unknowingly created a collective consciousness that transcended individual death. Samuel found Whitmore in his study one evening, hunched over his manuscript with ink-stained fingers and tears streaming down his face. "I can't remember them all," Whitmore whispered. "There were so many, and I never bothered to learn their names. How can I write about people I never saw as human?" Samuel climbed onto a chair beside the desk, his small hands carefully turning the pages of the manuscript. "You're learning to see them now. That's what matters." "Is it enough? Will it ever be enough?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. "The dead don't want perfection. They want acknowledgement. They want the world to know that they existed, that they mattered, that their lives had meaning beyond the labor they provided." Whitmore nodded, wiping his eyes with a trembling hand. "What happens when I finish this? What happens to you?" "I move on," Samuel said simply. "There are other plantations, other masters who need to remember. The work isn't finished until every story is told, every name is spoken, every life is acknowledged." And then Samuel smiled, and for the first time since his arrival, Whitmore saw something peaceful in the boy's expression. Then the dead can rest and the living can begin to heal. The manuscript was completed on a cold February morning in 1829. Whitmore had worked through the night, driven by a compulsion that felt larger than himself. As he wrote the final words, he felt something shift in the air around him, as if a great weight had been lifted from the plantation itself. Samuel appeared in the doorway of the study, dressed in the same simple clothes he had worn since his arrival, but somehow looking different, lighter, less burdened by the weight of accumulated memory. "It's done," Whitmore said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. Samuel nodded, approaching the desk to look at the completed manuscript. "You've given them their voices back. That's all they ever wanted. What happens to this?" Whitmore gestured at the thick stack of pages. "Who will read it? It will find its way to the people who need to see it. Truth has a way of surviving, even when people try to bury it." That afternoon, Samuel walked away from Whitmore Plantation for the last time. He carried no possessions, made no farewells, simply walked down the dusty road that led away from the cotton fields where he had spent the last year of his life. Whitmore watched him go from the window of his study, and as the small figure disappeared into the distance, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, a sense of peace. The plantation was still there, the cotton still needed to be picked, and the system of slavery still existed. But something fundamental had changed. The slaves who remained at Whitmore Plantation were different now. They carried themselves with a dignity that no amount of brutality could break, secure in the knowledge that their stories mattered, that their lives had meaning beyond their economic value. They had been reminded of their humanity, and that reminder could never be taken away. Word of Whitmore's manuscript spread throughout the region, copied by hand and passed from plantation to plantation. Other masters began to write their own accounts, driven by the same compulsion that had consumed Whitmore. The network of memory that Samuel represented had achieved its goal. The stories of the enslaved were being told, their names were being remembered, and their humanity was being acknowledged. The children who had appeared on plantations throughout the South began to disappear as mysteriously as they had arrived, their work complete. But the changes they had wrought remained, spreading like ripples through the consciousness of a nation built on the foundation of human bondage. Samuel himself was seen in many places over the following years, walking the roads between plantations, appearing in slave quarters to comfort the dying, standing in cotton fields where the earth held too many unmarked graves. He had become something larger than himself, a symbol of memory and justice that could never be completely destroyed. The boy who had arrived in chains had become the voice of the voiceless, the memory of the forgotten, and the conscience of a nation that had tried to build prosperity on the foundation of human suffering. His legacy would endure long after the last plantation had crumbled to dust, a reminder that some truths are too powerful to be buried, and that the dead have their own ways of ensuring that justice is served. In the end, Samuel had proven that memory is the most powerful force in human experience, stronger than chains, more enduring than institutions, and more persistent than the desire to forget. The stories of the enslaved would survive, passed down through generations, ensuring that the crimes of slavery would never be forgotten and that the humanity of its victims would never again be denied. The reckoning was complete, but the memory would endure.